Everybody. We have just reached 5 o'clock, so we're going to make a slow start. A very warm welcome from Trafalgar Property Management. My name is Peter Menon. I'm the Director for Legal and Branch Manager of the Birdhaven branch, and I'll be opening this evening in Andrew Schaefer's place. He could unfortunately not join us this evening, but with me today on the webinar, I've got some fantastic colleagues, and Sean is going to take you through everything you need to know about retirement villages. Almost everybody here will face this decision at some stage, if not for themselves personally or as an investment, then for a parent. And it tends to be made, or the decision at least tends to be made emotionally, often in a hurry, and often without anyone reading the fine print. And the fine print and technicalities is the most vital portion of this transaction, because the single most important question about retirement villages is deceptively simple. What exactly are you buying? Three schemes can look identical from the driveway, same clubhouse, same garden, and give you three completely different sets of rights. In one, you own the property. In another, you own a right to live there. In a third, you own shares in a company. Same view, very different legal reality. So the job for our excellent speaker this evening, who lives and breathes this world, Sean Germeshuizen, is going to unpack it properly for us. Sean Germeshuizen is a senior community scheme manager here at Trafalgar, also in the Birdhaven branch, with formal qualifications in sectional title scheme management through UCT and in homeowners association management through PINOX. He manages community schemes day in and day out. I've had the privilege of joining Sean on numerous meetings, and he's an excellent speaker and really simplifies complex matters. So he sees also exactly where residents and trustees and directors get caught out, and he's really the right person to take you through everything practically tonight rather than the theory. Also on the panel is our stalwart Karine Coetzee, the National Community Schemes Manager at Trafalgar from Cape Town. She obviously needs no introduction to this audience. She is going to be on hand to field any questions in the Q&A. But before we get going, just a few housekeeping matters before I hand over to Sean. We'll aim to wrap up in about an hour. You are automatically muted on this forum. It is through the Teams webinar system, so you can't go and unmute yourself. But what you can please go and do for us is go and answer your questions in the Q&A, not on the chat box, but on the Q&A box. It's going to go directly through to Corinne and myself. We'll answer some of the questions as we go along, but some of them we're going to keep for Sean at the end, just to make things a little bit simpler and obviously a little bit more cohesive as well. The slides and the recording will be circulated to everyone who is registered after the session, and they're going to go up as well on our YouTube channel. So if you have not had a sight of the previous webinars, we run one each and every single month, and we'll do so to the end of the year. The last one is going to be in November. You can go and have a look at the YouTube channel, and it's got all of the previous webinars loaded thereon as well. Our contact details are also going to come up at the end, so please do reach out to us afterwards. If you've got any queries or questions, or just need a chat about the webinar, you're more than welcome to do so. And then Corinne is also going to be sharing a feedback link in the Q&A when we're going through the contact details as well as the Q&A. So please go and fill that out for us. It's vitally important for our feedback. And we want to know what next webinars you'd like. Got some interesting ones scheduled for the rest of the year. But we'd love to have your feedback. Sean, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter, for the warm welcome, and welcome to our client webinars. So as you can see on the slide, what we'll cover within the webinar this afternoon is what a retirement village actually is, who qualifies as a retired person, the three main ownership models, as Peter has alluded to earlier, who owns the property under each, what rights a resident has within a retirement village, and who is responsible for maintenance after all. And then finally, what happens when a resident passes away with some statistics, etc. So let's get started. Sit back and enjoy the webinar. So as we start off, what is a retirement village? The topic is a common misunderstanding baked into this topic. A retirement village is a residential development designed specifically for older, or in other words, senior people, as I would like to call it. It provides accommodation together with services, facilities, and management structures that retired residents basically need. The governing legislation which these type of schemes operate under is called the Housing Development Scheme for Retired Persons Act 65 of 1988. So that's a mouthful, and for this purpose of the webinar, we'll call it the HDSRPA as an abbreviation. Notice that the Act does not actually define the words retirement village. It uses a broader idea of a housing development scheme for retired persons. And the single most important point on this slide this afternoon is that a retirement village is not in itself an ownership model. The very same village can be structured in one of three completely different legal ways. For example, life right, sectional title, or share bulk. So when a client tells you, I live in a retirement village, that tells you nothing yet about what they actually own. And as I will see over the next 20 minutes or so, that there's a clear distinction between these three, and who owns basically the property, who maintains it, and what happens when the resident passes on at the end of the day. A retirement village does not automatically mean that I own a house. As we go on to the next, so who actually qualifies to live in a retirement village? Very good question. Under section 1 of that long abbreviation, HDSRPA, a retired person is simply a person who is 50 years of age and older. Now that surprises a lot of people in the long run. Know that it has actually nothing to do with whether a person has actually stopped working or not. In actual fact, there's still a lot of people that work after the age of 50, as we know. But it's important to obviously not confuse the statutory age of 50 as directed by that particular act. In many villages, they impose their own higher entry age in their constitutions, or rules and life right agreements, or any other government document that they actually operate under. For argument's sake, I've seen many where they stipulate an age of 55 or 60 or even sometimes higher. The statute sets the floor. The scheme owns document can lift it. So finally, and this becomes very important as we go on later on, within the webinar, we will talk about death, look at section 7.1 of the Act, and it improves that no person other than a retired person or the spouse of a retired person may occupy the land. Hold that thought. The protection of the spouse is a statutory protection, and it will come back when we deal with it, the surviving spouse later on. Now, the ownership models. Firstly, the life right. The first of our three models, as you can see, and this is the one that most people misunderstand because the word buy is involved. With the life right, the member acquires a contractual right of occupation. So they do not acquire ownership of the dwelling. The Act defines a right of occupation as a housing interest that allows occupation for lifetime of the purchaser, but without giving the purchaser any power to claim transfer of ownership. So in plain terms, you buy the right to live there, and you do not buy the property in itself. The developer normally remains the registered owner of that particular property. So let me talk you through to the two slides with you. On the resident side, you'll see that they do not own the unit. They obtain a contractual right for occupation. They usually pay an initial purchase consideration up front, and they pay monthly levies or services charges. They occupy for life. or for whatever period the contract specifies, and they may have a contractual refund or resale entitlement when they leave. And importantly, they are protected by the HDSRPA. On the developer side, they normally retain the ownership. They manage and resell the housing interest when the right terminates, and they must comply with both the statutory requirements and the contract. The takeaway on this the takeaway to the land clearly with the audience is, with a life right, you buy a right and not the property. The second model is sectional title, which is much more familiar with most people, and that is the one that matches the instinct, I own my home. Here, the member acquires registered ownership of a section together with an undivided share in common property. Therefore, I buy Section 25 in a sectional title retirement scheme and a transfer register into my name. I can correctly say that I own Section 25. I also own an undivided share in common property in accordance with my participation quota. Section 16 of the Sectional Title Act puts it in this way. The common property is owned by the owner of a section jointly in undivided share, broken it into two parts for the audience. Firstly, as you can note, the section itself, that is the part that you exclusively own, for example, the apartment or the townhouse. And secondly, the undivided share in common property, that is the share of everything held on common property, the roads, the gardens, the clubhouse, the communal facilities, the pool, and potentially that would be also the exclusive use area allocated to you. The clean takeaway here with sectional title, you own your section and you own a share in common property. This is a real registered deeds office ownership, and that is why, as we'll see, it behaves very differently on death. So as we move on to the third model, shared block is usually the most confusing of all three of them. So let's take it slowly on this one. In a shared block scheme, a shared block company owns or leases the movable property to you. You as a member own shares in that particular company. Section 7 of the Share Block Control Act 59 of 1980 provides for an operation of a share block scheme and, critically, for the member's entitlement to use a specific part of the property under a use agreement. So in plain terms, I own a share in the company that owns the property. And those shares give me a contractual right to use a particular unit or a section. The point to stress here is, and that thing that catches people out the most, is the shareholder does not receive sectional title ownership of the dwelling. Similar to the life rights. You do not own the flat, you own the share, and the share carry right of use. It sits somewhere between the life right and sectional title, as I mentioned, more than a pure right of occupation, but it's not a registered ownership of the property as noted in the sectional title side, where it's in the deeds office. So the table on the slide presented is basically the heart of the entire talk thus far. It places the three models side by side so you can easily identify the differences and you can jump between those. If there is one slide to take away from this webinar, as I said, this is one of those. Now, what right does a resident have? Having set out the three models, the honest answer to that is, what does a resident have? It depends on the legal model and on the governing document. So rather than giving a false, one-sided, fits-all answer, we give a checklist to work through before signing anything. And again, I'm making emphasis on signing anything. The single most important message is critical, and that is the contract that you will be looking at. So before buying into any retirement village, read the agreement, get advice, because the contract, read with the legislation, determines almost all these answers. I'm going to run through those with you. But before we do, let's look at maintenance in regards to these three models. Maintenance is where the models really diverge in a day-to-day practice. and is where a lot of complaints come from. So firstly, there is no single answer that fits every retirement village. Whether a particular repair is the resident's problem or whether it's the scheme problem depends on 6 different things. Firstly, the ownership model, the applicable legislation, the contract, the rules, which part of the property is involved, and whether the resident can cause the damage. As a standing point, the responsibility broadly tracks the model. In life rights, you look to the Management Association plus the contract. In sectional title, the body corporate handles the common property and the owner handles their section. In share block, the company handles it. Read through the agreement. We'll take each of these 3, turn over the next 3 slides to determine exactly who's responsible for maintenance. So let's start with life right maintenance, because this is where residents most often assume the worst. The HDSRP regulation contains important maintenance provisions. So Regulation 8 of the government notice, and they call it the R1351, contemplates the Management Association maintaining the common property and the accommodation and keeping it in state of good service repair. The regulation also deals with relevant plant, machinery, fixtures and fittings, and shared services, and how all of these are funded through the levy structure. So the practical message on this is a life right holder should not automatically assume that they are responsible for all building maintenance, that there is common property and common and costly misconception in regards to this. Quite a lot of residents may sit with a management association where they regulate who's responsible in terms of maintenance. But, and this is the balancing point, the contract and the applicable regulations, in many cases a constitution, must still be checked for the internal items, any improvements, damages, etc. Appliances, and possibly any exclusive use areas that require maintenance. So not automatically the resident and not automatically the association. Check the contract, check the regulations, and check your rules and constitution. When we get to sectional title, it's a much easier determination. We're much familiar with this territory, and most of us are aware that because it works in a way that any sectional title scheme works, the framework distinguishes between the common property and the owner who has a section. So Section 3 of the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act requires the body corporate to establish an administrative fund sufficient for the repairs and maintenance, management and administration of the common property, and then together a reserve fund for future maintenance and repairs. So generally, the common property is the body corporate's responsibility. This section is the owner's responsibility and subject to the Act and the rules, and certain installations fall into a bit of a gray area, but it's important to have those clearly stipulated within your particular scheme rules, which would identify then those improvements. The clean line for the audience to take away is the common property is the body corporates and your own section is yours. So where something serves both, pipes, for example, is a good topic. You go back to the Act and the rules to work out where the line then obviously falls. Maintenance within a share block is naturally based on the property and its management within the company, the company that owns the particular share block structure. It is the obligation, and Section 13 of the Share Block Control Act requires that the share block company then establish and maintains a levy fund for the matters including the repairs, upkeep, control, management, and administration of the particular company, and then also its immovable property. The same fund then also can deal with rates, utilities, insurance, and the company's other obligations. So think of it in a simpler flow. The company owns or leases the property, and the company manages it, and the shareholders fund that operates through the levy structure. All of it subject to the governing documents. The shareholders' obligation is essentially the financial. Keep the levies paid, because the levy fund is what keeps the property at the end of the day maintained. Next topic is what a resident then has when they pass away. Now, we come to the part where clients worry about the most. And what happens when a resident dies? And predictably, by now, the answer depends entirely on the model. Taking across the three, as you can see on the slide, on the life right, the life right generally determines according to the agreement, and it is not inherited as an ownership of the unit. However, and this matter obviously to the family, a contractual financial entitlement may become payable to the deceased estate, for example, a refund or a share of the resale. Under sectional title, in other words, the unit is a property, it's owned, it forms part of the deceased estate, and it can be inherited or sold, subject to the retirement village's occupational restrictions. Under the share block, the shares form part of the estate and are dealt with accordingly with the company's documents and the use of the agreement. So the same event, the resident's death, produces three different legal outcomes. Over the next slides, we'll look more closely at the surviving spouse and then at the inheritance under sectional title and share block before finishing on the recent case that ties it all together. The slide is about the rule. Recall section 7 that I mentioned earlier, that is in the HTSRPA. It restricts occupation of the land to a retired person. Remember the 50 plus. Or the spouse of that particular retired person, subject to the statutory framework that it falls under. The consequence is important. When the life right holder dies, the surviving spouse right to remain in occupation is not purely a matter of what the contract says. It is grounded in statute itself. That is a protection Parliament built in. So there's been a recent High Court matter within this year still between the NG Kerk, Brackenhurst, Austria, Behuising, and HJB, and somebody else. They don't mention that. Considering exactly the situation, a surviving spouse in a life right retirement village. We'll look at the facts shortly. For now, the lesson to take away from this is plainly, the retirement village agreements must be interpreted together with the statutory framework and the actual circumstances. Do not reduce the question to contract says X without reading against the registration, because here the legislation protects the spouse and a contract cannot simply contract out of that protection to evict that spouse. In sectional title on death, it's more straightforward on the ownership side, but it carries one trap, and that catches families quite often. Because a sectional title unit is properly owned by the member, it forms part of a deceased estate. Now, executor can then deal with the property in ordinary way, transfer it to an heir or sell it. So far, normal, but here is the important distinction. And I'd underline it for the audience if I could. Ownership and the occupation are two different questions. And here may well inherit the unit. They become the owner, but they may not qualify to occupy in it. So many often you have the children below 50, and they could then not occupy within that retirement village, because remember, there's still a legal document that guides in terms of the age group that may live there. So a 50-year-old may inherit a unit in a village with a minimum age of 65. They own it, but they cannot move in. They can let it because the rules provide for it, or they can sell it, but they cannot occupy. Inheriting the asset is not the same as being allowed to live there. Very important. Share block on DEF mirrors the ownership structure we set up earlier. Remember, in a share block scheme, the member owns shares, not the apartment itself. So on death, the shares, not the unit, generally form part of the deceased estate. The underlying immovable property remains owned or leased by the share block company throughout. And that does not change. The executor's job is therefore a little bit more involved than with the sectional title, because it's a share and contract-driven setup. The executor must consider the company's constitutional documents and the share block agreement, the use agreement, and the transfer requirements, and the Share Block Control Act. Very important. The practical takeaway here is that the shares pass into the estate and are dealt with under those documents. But exactly as with sectional title, inheriting, the share does not automatically entitle the heir to occupy. Occupation still follows the use agreement and the scheme's rules. Now, here's that case study that I referred to earlier. It's a legal content and it's real, as I said, within this year, 2026. This is deliberately the applied companion to surviving spouse slide, which we saw and I mentioned earlier. The matter concerned a surviving spouse who was residing in a retirement village under a life right agreement after the original resident had passed away. It is a useful practical illustration of several of today's themes at once. The death of the original resident, the surviving spouse right to remain in the occupation, the wording of the contract, the statutory protection under Section 7, and an attempted eviction. All of that forming part of this matter. So without getting lost in the detail, the value of the case is what it teaches about the method. The lesson that we need to learn in this one is, being building towards all afternoon, the agreement must be interpreted together with the statutory framework and the actual circumstances of the people involved. You cannot resolve these questions by simply reading the contract in isolation. You have to read the contract, read the statute, and look at the real facts together with the rules of the scheme, etc., etc. This is how these disputes are actually decided upon. Now, after all the information that I've provided earlier up until now, let's look at things on a more personal level. The question to ask yourself is not only what am I buying, but more importantly, how will I live? Can I afford where I'm planning to go? How long do I plan going there for? Would I need any type of care in the long run? And lastly, what type of community would I love to live in? And the challenges that faces me as well. So one of the biggest mistakes prospective residents make in looking only at the purchase price or the life right contribution, one should consider this is a particularly important because the lowest priced does not necessarily mean the lowest lifetime cost. As published in 2026, the market information suggests that life rights purchases can range very widely from approximately 500,000 to 5 million or even more, with monthly levels commonly within the region of between 3,000 and 10,000 Rand a month, while rental retirement accommodation might range from between 5,000 and 25,000 Rand per month, believe it. These are broad market indicators rather than recommendational or guaranteed prices. So interesting facts there. Therefore, a key question to ask yourself is, if my income stopped increasing tomorrow, could I still afford to live here comfortably for the next 20 to 30 years? Now, moving into a retirement village is not simply a property decision, it is a longevity decision. A person may retire at 60 or 65, potentially live another 20 to 25 to 35 years. A financial plan, therefore, needs to be considered, which include the type of income you'll have, capital on hand, and any future expenditure that might occur. Very important. The critical question here is, what happens if I live much longer than what I expected? This is a risk. A retirement plan that works at the age of 65 would not always work at the age of 85. And there clearly you can see below those headings what you need to focus on. So don't forget healthcare and frail care. This should be one of the most important questions when selecting a village. Ask yourself the following. And that obviously depends on, sorry about that, that depends on how long you are planning to live. Find out, is there assisted living? Is there frail care? Is there a dementia or a memory care? Is there care available on site? Very importantly, many people move into retirement villages just to find that once they get to a point they can't look after themselves any longer and they need to look for a frail care, and there's no frail care on site. That means you have to pack up and leave, and you've got all these obligations that's still in the background to worry about. Is there a medical practitioner on site? Do somebody like that visit the retirement village? And how often do they do? Are there ambulance services available? And in many instances, there's links between the security company that's there and various emergency services that all link up to those. But it's important to ask. So what happens if the village cannot provide the required care? Can your spouse remain in the village if you move into the care? And I'm referring to that case study that we've just gone through. What are the costs of moving from independent living to assisted living? In other words, frail care. As I said, some retirement organizations provide a variety of care, while others require residents to move elsewhere when their care requirements increases. For example, the Flower Foundation explains that the residents may move from independent accommodation into the assisted living or frail care when they can no longer care for themselves. A very important question. Where will I live when I'm 85? Not just where will not just where will I live when I'm 65. Most importantly, always have that extra goal that one has to look at. Now, also important is these following aspects. This is an area that often is overlooked. People frequently move into retirement villages because they purely have to or they want to. But you have to look at security, convenience, maintenance, healthcare, and a safer environment. But one of the greatest benefits can actually be social and social connections. Be encouraged to ask before you move into a retirement village. Will I know people here? Are there clubs, walking groups, exercise classes, golf, bowls, bridge, guards, book clubs, gardening, bird viewing, church groups, etc.? Are there social events, restaurants, coffee mornings? It's good and it's suggested to keep busy at your senior age. The danger is moving from a large family home into a beautiful retirement village unit and then discover that you're actually, at the end of the day, quite lonely. So it's important to make sure that you do your homework on that. This slide really deserves a discussion on its own. However, in short, moving into a retirement village often means giving up many things. For example, a family home, those who love gardens, large gardens, a garage, a workshop. Remember, there's always rules in these type of schemes. Family memories, neighborhood relationships, familiar surroundings, possessions, accumulated over 30, 40 years. For some people, this is liberating. For others, it can feel like a loss of identity and independency. Therefore, ask, am I moving because I genuinely want to live in a retirement village? Or is it because someone else thinks I need to live in a retirement village? The timing of the move is extremely important. It is generally easier to make the decision while you are still healthy and mobile and financially independent rather than waiting for a medical crisis. And very important. As I said, this deserves a whole discussion on its own. There's various aspects one has to take into account here. And many people find that once they are in a critic situation, that many retirement villages rules do not accommodate them occupying a unit within that particular retirement village. And they go through a process, a medical check process. So it's important to ask yourself these questions. So a recap on possible red flags that you need to take note of. Number one, pricing. Number two, what type of ownership? Life rights, sectional title, share block. 3, what happens if we exit? Are there costs involved? Can I still remain? Can I resell? Fourthly, the future cost is invisible. Do I plan to only live and move in at 65, or am I planning to go through and accommodate up until 85, maybe even 110, who knows? So before you ask the hard questions. And those are as follows. What exactly am I buying? Do I own the property? What happens if my spouse dies? Can children inherit the interest? And what happens if I need frail care? What does the levy cover at the end of the day? Your living rules. Can the levy increase? Are special levies possible? What are the village rules? Can they change? Can my family, grandchildren, or pets stay over, come and visit? And for how long? Can I rent the unit out? What happens when I sell or terminate? And what is the refundable? When and after which deductions? Some statistics. So as we approach the end of our webinar, this is actually a very interesting presentation point. South Africa's aging population is creating a growing potential market for retirement living. Now, Stats SA reports that the number of South Africans aged 60 and older increased from approximately 3.6 million in 2002 to 6.6 million in 2025. That's a huge increase. That means older persons now represent approximately 10.5% of South Africa's population, they say. So the potential market is substantial, 6.6 million people aged 60 plus. But there's an important distinction. Not every person aged 60 is a potential retirement village resident. Many older South Africans continue to live in their own family homes, or they live with children or extended family. They cannot simply afford private retirement accommodation, prefer to remain in the existing communities, and are still working, so simply do not want to move. Now, Lightstone in May 2026 provided an analysis and the interesting picture of the actual retirement village market. It identified approximately 400 retirement establishments containing around 45,000 units, with Gauteng and Western Cape accounting for approximately 70% of those establishments. About 30,000 units were in sectional title schemes and 15,000 estates. That means retirement villages are still a relative small part of the overall housing market for older retirement, for older persons in South Africa. Lightstone estimates that approximately every one unit in retirement establishment, there are about 30 properties owned by people aged 60 outside of retirement establishments. Now, I don't think they took into account life rights because, again, as we learned earlier, Lightstone is based on deed searches, and that does not include the life rights sector. Now, lastly, most important, don't choose a retirement village only for the house. Choose it for the life you expect to live there. I've got a few references that you're welcome to go through once you get the information. And Peter, I'm going to hand over to you for the answer and the question and answer session. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Sean. That was exceptional. Really great presentation and so much information. I just wanted to say, I'm not doing the answers. You're doing the answers. I'm going to ask you the questions.
You're welcome.
But I mean, wow, what a complex system at the end of the day, hey? Having a look at this, it's incredibly important that the real nitty-gritty technicalities, the contracts, all of that is gone through before the time. You can end up with a situation that you don't really know what you're buying or buying into. And it will only prop up a lot later. So it's very important to get the correct advice from the beginning. Just as a sort of starter, we didn't get a lot of questions through the chat, but I'd like to ask you, could any of our clients contact you or people that are not clients just to ask you some advice on this after the fact too?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm happy to assist with any questions. Yeah, welcome to either phone me or send me an email. Glad to help.
Thank you very much, Sean. Sean's contact details is going to come up in a minute, as well as mine and Corinne's if you've got different questions as well. So, Sean, just to get to two that was posed in the chat, and I know you've already dealt with this in terms of the case law, but I do think repetition is important when it comes to very impactful questions. If two elderly pensioners are living together in a life rights property, how do they ensure that the surviving spouse can still stay in the property if the life rights owner passes away? What protection measures are there?
Good question. And as I referred to that case, I think from 2026, maybe it was a bit dark previously, but it's come to light more for us. And that is to make sure that one ensures that Section 7 is clearly identified within any agreement that you're going to sign. Make sure that that gets covered. I've seen it before, and I think that's the reason why the court was tested with this. And luckily, we got an answer, a clear answer, and that helps us to obviously make sure that we can make provision going forward on that particular item.
Yeah, very important. And I mean, you can always negotiate or enter into addendum after the fact, but it's going to be very tricky trying to negotiate when the contract's already closed.
Yes, it does make it difficult, especially when it comes to life rights. But I mean, there's always opportunity to discuss it with the developer and the company owners. Yeah.
Sean, in a share block company, can the company claim a percentage of the selling price should the person choose to sell or disinvest?
Yeah. Remember, you sell your shares. So I would think if there is a chance that there's a claim on any of that, it needs to be clearly identified within that lease agreement or that contract that you sign. Again, very important. Make sure that you tick all the boxes, as I've mentioned, go through that and ensure that that is clearly identified so that when that obviously takes place, we can look at it and action as it's identified with and in that particular agreement.
Excellent. Yeah, with something like that, I mean, you've got sanctity of contract. So the developer or the person at the end of the day that's drawing these up, if it's not contradictory to the act or the acts, they can certainly still do so.
Yes.
100% agreed.
Yeah.
So just one from I believe it's a Mr. Finlay. Sorry, I'm just reading this through quickly. So for a person that's under 50, and obviously dealing with the definition here as well, is a purchase or an investment in a retirement village worth the investment? I think this one really does depend on the rental pricing that you're going to get at the end of the day, but it is very important to go and have a look at that and do the proper research, correct, Sean?
Yeah, so I, for one, obviously been dealing with it for quite some time, many years. I would definitely recommend a retirement as a investment. I know of many. If I look at what I basically manage, there's a lot in most instances, I would say, Peter. It's either the children that are actually the investors, and they all below 50 most of the time. It all depends on the demographic of the particular scheme, and what the values of those properties. So yeah, I would say in the long run, it is still a very good investment option.
And what Andrew mentioned as well when we were prepping for the session was that in some of those instances as well, the parents are placing the, let's call it the property in the name of the kids as well, to ensure inheritance tax, etc., on death is dealt with in a different way. So there's a bunch of options when it comes to this, and I definitely would suggest, as Marilyn has said in the chat, it's not a question, but you need to go seek professional assistance before you enter into contracts like this. It's very important to go and read the T's and C's.
Definitely, and especially because we're dealing with seniors, it's very, very important. Very important. You don't want to be found on the back foot at the end of the day. And that the laws are there to assist you. I mean, just for argument's sake, before I even started with this passion, I thought it was simply just a retirement village. You move into a scheme and that is it. But if you really delve into it, like we've done this evening, there's a lot of options, a lot of things that one has to consider before you even start looking at a type of retirement village.
I love that slide that you created with the questions that a person needs to ask or at least think about before purchasing, because that is actually going to give you a very good indication of what you're actually buying. So once again, those slides are going to be shared after the fact, and you can go and have a look at those. You don't even need to ask for them. Corinne's going to send them to you direct. Sean, I know you've dealt with this one previously, but if a developer goes under, what happens to the life right? They still the registered owner, of course. What happens to that life right itself?
Yeah, so funny that you ask. We are faced with a scenario at this point in time with a particular ownership or developer. And with various legal opinions, it has been confirmed that, remember, there's a contractual obligation between two different parties, and that just doesn't fall into the water. There's responsibilities in terms of that. So if it is that the developer goes under, the new owner of that particular scheme will then have to take the responsibilities of those contracts over as it is. And I would think the best option then is to discuss it with the particular owner and then see as an opportunity to see whether there's any amendments to that particular contract. Maybe you weren't afforded a opportunity to discuss it previously with the developer, but obviously with the new one, I'm sure that they would look into that for you.
Excellent. Just from Wilhelmina, can it be confirmed on the maintenance of the buildings in life right contracts? So the building obviously belongs to the developer, who is responsible for the external portions, the internal portions, and I believe your answer to this question was it really does depend on a number of things, including the agreement that you signed.
Exactly. So in most instances, life right, it does clearly distinguish who's responsible for maintenance. But in I've come across a few different ones where the developer refers that particular responsibility to the management committee. So I do have a retirement village where the management committee then caters for common area, as we all know it, on maintenance projects. And then as and when a life right comes up for resale, then they also tend to the internal maintenance of those sections. So it all depends on what the scheme's rules say, and most important, what does that contract say, that life right contract?
Sean, on a very general one here, but can a village legally refuse to let my grandchildren live with me or bar somebody under a specific age from living in the unit?
They most definitely can, Peter. Just stepping back to the start of our webinar, remember the act that I referred to, that whole mouthful of words. The law states that you're not allowed to live within a scheme if you are under 50 years. So yeah, your grandchildren cannot live with you. I am aware, though, that there are circumstances in certain retirement villages where the rules clearly state where you perhaps have a special needs child. And in those cases, a medical certificate, various clauses within a contract, and a open constitution or rules that clearly identifies that could possibly allow a couple like that to live in. But as I said, the law stays quite straightforward. It's a 50+ scenario.
Sean, dealing with management a little bit here. Do we manage these schemes or at least the different ownership structures differently at Trafalgar? I mean, you in certain instances going to be dealing with an HOA, possibly in other instances you're dealing with sectional title and with share block. Do we manage differently, or is it very straightforward? Obviously, the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act and associated legislation is going to apply in the one instance. But does the management differ?
Yeah, I would say, in actual fact, if one delved into it more specifically, the management setup of any scheme is basically the same. There's similar obligations that is required to be done, for argument's sake, a budget, maintenance plans, following rules, administration, etc., etc. But remember the three models, and that's where the differences come in. Each have separate acts that they fall under, where, for argument's sake, again, just a recap, life rights, those schemes generally fall under the Constitution. They've got their own set of rules, own set of legal requirements. Sectional title falls under the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act. Share block falls under the Share Block Act. So in a nutshell, the management type is the same, but there are rules and conditions that follow those at the end of the day, and you have to incorporate those within the management style that you use for those specific retirement villages.
Sean, and then just two more for you, please.
Sure.
In your opinion, what is the best structuring for retirement villages?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. What is the
best structuring? So, of the three models, what would you suggest is the best structuring? It's a tricky one.
Yeah, it's a tricky one.
You're the one with the experience, eh?
Yeah. It's a tricky one, Peter. I like them all.
Well,
I like them all, but I would say the easiest is sectional title. It's a straightforward go buy and go sell, whatever the case is. Life right a bit trickier because now you've got a contract that you need to look at. Very specific. And so as share block as well, contracts, conditions that one has to look at. And what happens thereafter is one has to look at various resale costs, etc. Where in sectional title, it's simple. You get a valuation and you sell the property to the first taker. I like them all actually, but as I say, the simplest is sectional title.
I would agree with you. That straight ownership is just it's a lot simpler at the end of the day, specifically on inheritance and the way that everything's being structured on a person passing away. And then the final one, because we love this at the end of the day and approaching CSOS, can any person within these three ownership structures also approach CSOS?
Sorry, can they approach CSOS?
Yes, can they approach CSOS?
Definitely they can. It's remember the Community Schemes Ombud Service is set up to assist schemes after all, and those are schemes, irrespective of what they are registered as. They do confine to a levy, CSOS levy that they pay, and automatically the door is open for them to obviously be used.
Can I slip in?
Go for it,
Sorry,
Corinne, please.
I just want to slip in one last question. The question came up in the Q&A, can there be a combination of legal types in one retirement village?
Good question, Corinne. Definitely there are. I am aware of retirement villages that are both life right and sectional title at the end of the day. I haven't heard of or seen anywhere it's sectional title and share block, but truly there are life right and sectional title, which makes it a bit difficult because now you've got additional acts that you need to look at. But as I said, the principal matter of management is the same. It just depends on the rules and regulations that those particular ones fall under.
Yeah, I've seen sectional title and share block, where it started as a share block company, and the share block company then decided to start selling off sections. So then you could have, with that transitional period, you could have both.
Yes, yeah. I haven't seen that in retirement village though, but yeah, I'm going with you.
Yeah, very interesting and so complex. Sean, Corinne, thank you very much. Truly appreciate it. That brings us to an end, everybody. A very big thank you once again for joining us this evening. If you want to contact any of us, the contact details were up on the screen, but they are going to be in the slides as well, so you can go and have a look at that. They are going to be circulated automatically by Corinne, so you don't need to ask for them. And remember, all the previous webinars that we've done is on YouTube, so go and access that, please. It's just Trafalgar Property Management, and you're going to find our channel. We truly thank you for joining us this evening. We hope you have a lovely rest of the week. And go Bokke. Have a good one.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Take care.